Blog Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to Songs of Selah here on 17 Numa Radio. I'm your host, Scott Thomas Outler, and I want to thank you for tuning in this afternoon. It is Saturday, April the 27th, 2019, and we will be here for the next hour. Looking forward to today's episode. Have a great guest lined up coming on in the next segment. Marc Zegans will be joining the show to talk about his new book, Typewriter Underground, as well as several of the collaborative projects that have been born out of that creation and other aspects of the creative life. So looking forward to that conversation. Here at the top of the show, I did have just a couple of quick notes that I want to touch on. Firstly, hope everyone is having a good weekend so far. Here outside of Atlanta, the birds are singing and the sun is shining. So I hope that everyone out there is staying inspired and motivated here as the month of April winds down in whatever path your life is leading down at the moment. And for me, that happens to be mostly concerned with poetry and writing. And on that note, I did want to mention that my latest book of Sand and Sugar was published this month, released through Cyberwit, a publisher out of India. Copies of that are available through Cyberwit and also on Amazon, or if there's anyone interested in picking up a personalized copy directly from me, I do have some of those on hand at the moment. You can shoot me a message via email at 17numa@gmail.com or on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or any of those other social media platforms, and I'd be more than happy to work that out with you. Your support of independent publishers and artists is greatly appreciated. So doing this episode a little bit earlier than normal. Thank you to Marc Zegans for being accommodating in that fact, because I'm heading out to Atlanta later this evening for an event hosted by the UUCA called Wine, Cheese, and Spoken Word, and that is run by Carol Welter, who is a friend and also a past guest here on Songs of Selah. So anyone that might be interested in checking out the interview that she did, or any of the other past guests who have been on the program, can find the archive here on 17 Numa Radio. Also at my website, 17numa.com, that archive can be found. And I would ask that anyone listening would please subscribe to 17 Numa Radio. It's free, it's easy. Just click on the follow button found above the slideshow where this episode is streaming, and that'll get you signed up and in the loop to receive notifications for all the future episodes and excellent and informative guests that are lined up in the months ahead. I do appreciate that, and anyone who helps spread the word about the show, thank you as well. That just about wraps things up here at the top. Gonna have Marc Zegans joining the show just around the bend after this track from Tom Waits. Cheers.
lost at the diner, Emma's 49er. There's a rendezvous of strangers around a cafe in the night. All the gypsy hacks and the insomniacs, now the paper's been read. Now the waitress said, eggs and sausage and a side of toast, coffee and a roll, hash browns over easy, chili in a bowl with burgers and fries. What kind of pie? It's a graveyard charade, it's a late shift masquerade. And it's 2 for a quarter, dime for a dance, Woolworth rhinestone, diamond earrings, and a sideways glance. Now the register rings, now the waitress sings. Eggs and sausage, side of toast, coffee and a roll, hash browns over easy, chili in a bowl, burgers and fries. What kind of pie? Classified section offers no direction. It's a cold caffeine in a nicotine cloud, and the touch of your fingers lingers burning in my memory. I've been 86th from your ski. Now I'm in a melodramatic nocturnal scene. Now I'm a refugee from a disconcerted affair. Now the lead pipe morning falls. Now the waitress calls. Eggs and sausage. Now a side of toast. Now coffee and a roll. Hash browns over easy. Chili in a bowl with burgers and fries. Now what kind of pie? Alamo, if you will. Just come in and join the crowd. Had some time to kill. See, I just come in to join the crowd. Had some time to kill. Just come in and join the crowd. 'Cause I had some time to kill.
Welcome back to Songs of Selah. That was Eggs and Sausage by Tom Waits. And without further ado, I want to introduce today's guest. Marc Zegans is a working poet and spoken word artist. His collections include The Underwater Typewriter, Boys in the Woods, Pillow Talk, and The Book of Clouds. He's recorded 2 albums, Night Work and Marker and Parker, the latter in collaboration with pianist Dawn Parker. Marc has worked regularly in immersive theater as a producer, author, and performer, and has been introducing audiences to the Typewriter Underground and live performances since 2016. Marc's Typewriter Underground saw its debut as a full theatrical production directed by Janice Blaze Rock at the Henry Miller Library, Big Sur, in June 2018. He lives by the coast in Northern California. Marc's poetry can be found at marczegans.com, and he can be reached for creative advisory services at mycreativedevelopment.com. So I want to thank you for joining the program today, Marc. How are you?
Great. It's a real pleasure to be here, Scott, and thanks for playing that Tom Waits tune. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, absolutely. Always enjoy Waits' work, and I guess that's a good place to start because I always like to ask guests for a song that they might like as an intro, and you picked that one, said that Waits was one of the artists that got you inspired to start following that path of spoken word. So maybe you want to talk a moment about how that came about and what his work means to you and sort of how your journey began.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, I was about 14 years old, I think, and I was listening to our local radio station, WPLR, and the DJ came on and said, I've got something new to play by this guy named Tom Waits, and I'd never heard of him. This was way back when he was just starting out his career, and he put a piece on from this same album, Nighthawks at the Diner, called Emotional Weather Report, and it's a spoken word piece over a jazz combo, and I was just absolutely blown away. I'd never heard anything like that, and I said, I've got to hear more of this guy. So I went down to go buy the album at the local record store, and I found out it was a double album, and I couldn't afford it. I didn't have enough cash in my pocket, so I went out and mowed a few lawns and things like that, did some errands, got the money, took the bus back downtown, got the record, and was absolutely hooked by the way that he blends this really original concrete description of places that we all go to, like diners and things like that, with a sense of loss and yearning and urgency about it, plus this kind of hipster style of delivering it, and the combination simply opened up the possibility of speaking in ways like that had never, ever, ever entered my mind before. And years later, when I began to write poetry and I started to think about doing spoken word, that's one of the things that came back to me right away. So he opened a channel for me very early in my life.
Very nice. So what area do you live in, and have you always been living there? There in San Francisco now?
Yeah, I've moved around my whole life. I'm living in Santa Cruz, California right now, right by the Monterey Bay. I've been here about 7 years, and I spent part of my growing up in San Francisco, so I'd come down to Santa Cruz fairly often and loved it here and said one day I'll come back. But I've lived in many places around this country and spent part of my childhood and part of my teenage years living in London, England as well.
Oh, okay, wow. That must have been a great experience over there. You say you're living in Monterey Bay right now. I saw that you had posted about a reading that you were at last night, the Bridging the Bay. How did that event go?
That was great. Really big turnout. It's at a beautiful little college called Monterey Peninsula College, and they gathered up 5 poets from around the Monterey Bay, wonderful people, and we all had a chance to read, share our work, and hang out with a very, very warm, very enthusiastic crowd. And I got to do a bit of reading from the Typewriter Underground, which is my latest book, and then read a chapbook that I recently wrote called The Snow Dead, which was recently accepted for publication, and I hope will be coming out later this year.
Oh, great news. Congratulations on that chapbook. With the Typewriter Underground, that's where I really want to get to the meat of this interview, because it seems like you've been doing so many different collaborative projects with plays and jazz ensembles and these readings you do, and so maybe start from the beginning and talk about where the inspiration for the book came and just where it's gone off in all its tangents from there.
Oh, cool, sure. So I had this idea a couple of years ago, back in the summer of 2016, that I wanted to try a fictive poetry project. Most of the poetry I'd written to that point was from life. And I've been thinking for a long time about how the internet world we now live in fights hard to capture our attention, to sort of grab who we are and direct it toward the ends of advertisers and the people who run internet services. And so I wondered, what if there was a bohemia that emerged during this time of people who dropped out from the internet world and went back to communicating by typewriter and prizing typing single sheets and sharing them around in a smaller community? What would happen as a result of that? What would that world be like? And so I developed the premise that this world actually did exist and that we began discovering it sometime later through fragments of verse that surfaced in one place or another. And that's how we discovered this group of people who are living right under our noses. And so I began to write poems in what I call verse fragments, capturing characters in the typewriter underground and pieces of its history. And I decided with my publisher fairly early on in the project that we didn't want to do it the way poetry books are conventionally published. You write a book, you put it out, you schedule a few readings. If you're lucky, you get to talk on some shows like this, and that's sort of it. I wanted the poetry to have a larger creative impact and for it to develop a life of its own. So I decided, along with my publisher, that what we do is bring out pieces of this verse in various fashions and in various ways long before the book ever came out. And that to the extent that I could, I'd collaborate with other people. So I began doing readings at various places and fairly regularly with a group that I'm associated with called the Poetry Brothel, which is an immersive theater experience. And I also began working with filmmakers and people in theater and musicians and others to say, how can we bring this idea of the typewriter underground to life based on the verse, but in all these different media? And that's what we've been doing since. And then after about a year and a half of walking around with the book that way, we actually published the book March 1st, and now it's going out into the more conventional poetry world. And the experience has been absolutely delightful. It's given me a chance to work with very, very talented artists and actors and filmmakers, including my partner in crime, Eric Edelman, who did the collages for the book and made several absolutely extraordinary short animated videos based on fragments of the verse.
His artwork in that book, I've been reading through it here recently, is just amazing, and the poems are great as well. I love the way that you capture all these different characters, and I wonder what the process is for you when you're creating those different sort of psychologies and atmospheres of each character, diving into them and sort of becoming those characters as you're writing them. What's that like?
It's the kind of thing that I tend to do late at night where I drop into the world. I imagine myself being in that world and what's happening there. And it's almost as if I'm traveling around in that space and seeing whom I bump into and learning their stories. So if you can imagine that you're kind of sitting at the corner of a bar late at night and you're talking to the person next to you and they begin to tell their tale, or they begin to tell a story about someone they know who's in this world, and then you discover who they are. And as I learn about them, I begin to think about, how do I represent this person as a poet? If I was someone who was capturing the history of the typewriter underground, what would I say about this person and his or her role in it and their contribution? That's where they come from in terms of the process of seeing them and getting to know them. They have a common theme, though. A lot of these characters, in one way or another, are limited, or they're damaged, or they come from a place where they don't find a home easily in mainstream society, and yet they're highly creatively motivated. So what do they do? What do they create from that place that has meaning, and how does that connect? the irony of the Typewriter Underground, and this comes out in verse that's going to be released later past the book, is that a lot of these characters, as strange and damaged as they are, become magnets of attention, and a world begins to form around them. And so the question about, as primary creators, how do they live in an environment that's now looking to feed off of what they're doing?
Yeah, like there's one character in there that talks about how art shouldn't be quantified and all of this, and then they start pouring the checks into his pocket. He's just like, oh, yes, thank you. That was one of my favorite pieces in there. But it does lend itself to, it sounds like you have this in mind for further creations using this world, because it's sort of still wide open, all the places you could go with it, and fleshing out some of those characters even more. And so look forward to reading any future work in that vein.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just thanking you, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the opening that was done at the Henry Miller Library there in Big Sur. He's one of my favorite authors, so I thought that might be cool to hear about when that was initially launched.
So it premiered on June 15th, 2018, last year, and I began working on it about a year before that with Janice Blaze Rock, who's a wonderful individual. Janice lives down near Monterey and puts on literary performance art pieces regularly in the communities down there, and she blends live readings with music, with film, with dance, and with extraordinary psychedelic lighting by a guy named Nelson Basden, who works almost all of her shows. And she's really created a remarkable way to present poetry and short verse in these various fora. And so I had been in some things that Janice had done, and she and I began talking about the idea of taking the Typewriter Underground onto stage and making it a full-scale theatrical production. Henry Miller occurred to both of us right away. They've got a beautiful outdoor theater that they run during the summers, and it's out under the redwoods in Big Sur. It's got a full stage out in this beautiful, beautiful setting, and a full-scale cinema-quality movie screen hanging above the stage, so you can run a mix of films and live performance. And Magnus Torin, who directs the library, has worked with Janice before. He and I knew each other slightly, and for many, 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 many years, I'd wanted to do something at Henry Miller. And so we went to Magnus, and he said yes, and we began planning the show.
Very cool. I know that you're involved and immersed in all of these projects that are coming out at the moment. Have you had a chance to sort of step back from it and say, like, wow, my writing has led to all this? And like, how does that feel, seeing all these productions born from your words?
It's a great feeling, and your question about have I had a chance to step back, that's literally just what I'm starting to do right now. I'm starting to take a little bit of stock of what's happened and thinking about what's the next phase of this and how do I invite other people into the process so that the world expands. My idea has always been that if I did the verse in this right and I shared it with the right people, that it would become a catalyst for people's own creative adventures in this space. And I've been amazed at the quality and the beauty of the work that's come out of that. Some of the films are just glorious, and they're starting to get shown at film festivals around the country, and later this spring also overseas. That's been extraordinary for me. I was interviewed a couple of weeks back by a guy named Dave Bonta, who runs a wonderful magazine and sort of clearinghouse site for video poetry called Moving Poems Magazine. And Dave really gave me a chance to talk about the relationships between this verse and the filmmakers and begin to think about what does this mean and how do we do more of it.
Where are those ideas leading here in the preliminary stages? Anything popping up?
Well, I'm talking to a couple of theater producers back east who are interested in doing productions of various aspects of the Typewriter Underground that draw on the verse that's in this book and then some additional verse that I've written that they've got their hands on. And one group is up in Boston, and then the other is a producer down in New York, and she wants to build a production around a character that's in the book named Dop, who is an interviewer who does her interviews on the steps of a bouncy house that she runs. And so she's fascinated by the idea of putting Dop's bouncy house on stage and turning it into a forum for doing a full-length theatrical piece.
Great. Sounds wonderful. The idea behind the book is just so rich with ideas and possibilities because there's so much dissatisfaction with society as it is and social media also. And I wonder what your thoughts are on social media in general, for artists in particular.
Well, it's sort of a mixed bag. You know, as artists, because many of the conventional channels for getting your work out as a result of what's happened on the Internet have disappeared, and because everyone has access to it now, you sort of have to use it to some degree if you want to share your work and communicate your work. At the same time, the architecture of things like Facebook and Twitter are set up to grab your time, grab your attention, compensate you poorly, if at all, for what you're doing, and divert your energy, along with the energy of the people who are participating, to purposes that aren't entirely yours. And the Typewriter Underground represents a sharp creative response to that, to say, let's think about what it means to take responsibility for our own attention, for our own creative initiative, and how we share it, and how can that manifest. It's interesting that this question about the attention media and what it's doing has become, in the last few months, the center of a pretty significant conversation among scholars. 3 books have come out quite recently, one by a guy named James Williams, who used to work at Google and who's now a philosophy professor at Oxford, a second by a guy named Cal Newport, who's a computer science professor at Georgetown University and has just released a book called Digital Minimalism, and then a guy named Tim Wu at Columbia who wrote a book recently called The Attention Merchants. And they're all focusing from a policy perspective and from a social science perspective on what is this stuff doing to our brains, what is this doing to our democracy, and how can we respond. And their responses are fascinating, their thoughts are fascinating, and they're beginning to develop sort of lay practical responses to that. But what's missing from that work, and what I think poetry and what these productions can add, is what does it mean to take back fully your creativity? And what does it also mean to think about using the social media, appropriating it, if you will, as a vehicle for deeper dialogue? And one of the things that I've done is I created a Typewriter Underground group on Facebook, which people can ask to join. It's a closed group, but if you ask, and you're there for legitimate reasons, we'll invite you in. That's now about 840 people. And these are folks who are really interested in doing their own creative thing and creating camaraderie around that. And that's been a wonderful appropriation of that piece of social media in connection with the book, because it's grounded in something authentic, and it's grounded in supporting people's creative growth rather than distracting them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you're touching on there. It's apart from all the memes and just constantly rewiring our brains for the short attention span blips and radars on the screen to actually get focused with other people of like minds or of unlike minds, just to get that deeper dialogue going. It's a great undertaking, and glad to hear about it. Speaking on the opposite spectrum of social media and being dialed in and connected to these electronic gadgets, what role does nature and natural environment play in your writing?
It plays a huge role. I'm deeply, deeply, deeply connected to the outdoors from the time that I was a small child. In fact, one of the little collections that I wrote that was published a few years ago by a small press called Crane Maiden is called Boys in the Woods, and it's about the experience of boys going out into the wilderness and bonding and fighting and fishing and doing all the things that boys do, and how that being in the woods really affects your connection to the world and who you are and how you live. I noticed when I was in my 30s, my then wife and I had a house that we'd go visit in the country from time to time, and we'd invite friends up from the city and have them come out for a few days. And I remember folks whose lives had been primarily urban would get really scared when we'd go out in the woods, especially if we were out in the woods at night. And there was a fear of nature that was deeply grounded because they never had the experience as children of being out there and listening to the sounds of the forest, looking up through cracks in the canopy of the trees at the stars and things like that. And so the experience was overwhelming and terrifying. And that has always made me think hard about how do we bring nature more into people's lives? How do we help it resonate? And in the case of my own son, I made sure that when he was a small boy, we went out walking in the woods at night so he could experience that and develop a closeness to and a love for nature while it was organic, while his brain was forming, while it was available to him.
There is something to that. I can remember the first time that I got away from the city streetlights and truly saw the stars for the first time in their infinite array up there, and just what a different experience that is than the limited scope that we have here in the cities or the suburbs even. It's just a powerful connection with the vastness of this universe. I think it's something that artists should really consider getting out into nature as much as possible, really taps into those primal instincts and inherent connections to the spiritual world, really.
That's the reason I ended up coming back to California and choosing to live out here in Santa Cruz, because almost every day I spend some time walking by the bay, and the redwoods are very, very close by, so I can get up into the woods and I can see that, and I'm only an hour and a half away from Big Sur, and the ability to be in that kind of nature, to be right next to a marine sanctuary, and to experience that on a daily basis, it fills me up, and it gives me a sense of wonder that makes it possible to write, and to write more truly than if I'm nested in an environment that's entirely man-made. And it also gives me a sense of perspective. I'm small in this world and small in this universe, and knowing that you're just part of something much larger, I think especially as you get older, is a very peaceful feeling.
Absolutely. That's well said. So I want to get back to something you had mentioned earlier. You talked about the Typewriter Underground being fictive poetry. How was this process in writing Typewriter Underground different from the other books that you had previously published, and what's your general routine as far as writing goes?
Well, this was different in a very important sense. My feeling about writing poems is there's no such thing as a poem that's simply natural or a true confession or a true story. There are always made-up or adjusted elements in it, in part because of the limitations of language, in part because we're choosing to emphasize or de-emphasize certain aspects of the experience. We're being selective because we use rhythm and line breaks and things like that to give it shape as a poem. At the same time, there's no fictional poem that's just purely made up, because we're always drawing on elements from life to create a scene, to create a story, or to create an experience. So going back to that Tom Waits song at the beginning, he's talking about an idealized diner, and he's catching elements from real life that make that place. But the poem or the song, whatever you want to call that, there is kind of a grand fiction. And so when I'm writing poems from life, what I do is I try to draw deeply on the experience and communicate the emotional heart and the physical feel of that experience in life in a way that someone can be moved by it or imagine it or sense the deeper emotional truth of it. When I'm writing for the Typewriter Underground, what I do first is I imagine the setting, the context, what's happening. What are these people doing and why? Where did they come from? What are their motives? As actors in this open-ended play, this open-ended drama, what's motivating them? And what's limiting them? And what resources do they have to find in themselves to proceed? And from that, I begin to get a sense of the character, their name, their history, their story. And as I do that and situate them in a specific place, say a city or a town or something like that, I begin to find details from the real world that make what they're doing concrete. And I build those details up into the life of a fictive character. And what's wonderful about it for me is that it's not about me, and it's not a translation of something I've done. It's an exploration about something that might be. I find that I tend to get ideas for the Typewriter Underground in transit, when I'm going to some place or when I'm someplace for a short period of time or when I'm having a conversation with someone that's fleeting. And the ideas kind of bounce around in my head for a while, and then they start to come out often in terms of the name of a character, and I start to get a line or an image. And when that happens, I jot it down, and then later when I've got time, I'll sit down, often late at night for this, and I will write the character out as fully as I can, and then keep at it until I've got a completed poem or a sketch of a poem. And then over time refine it and tighten it up, share it with some people, figure out what's working and not. I was very lucky in writing the early verses from the Typewriter Underground because I have a dear friend who lives back east, and she's a poet and a playwright and an actor, and she let me read the earliest drafts of the Typewriter Underground to her as soon as I had created them. And what was wonderful about that was the premise was these are things that are being discovered. And so it felt like, oh, wow, I found this poem and I'm sharing it with this person. And the opportunity to read them on the phone to her as they came out really, really, really brought the project to life for me. That's not at all typical of what I do when I'm writing the other kinds of poems. With those, usually something inside me, something I've observed or something that I experienced moves me to want to write a poem. And I may have a sense of what I want to say or some lines. But then what I do is I sit with myself and say, where does this want to go? And what is it that I've seen or what is it that I've done or that I know someone who's done that I want to shape into a poem? And so I work it from that perspective, trying to stay very close to life and asking the question, what does using verse as a medium of communication allow me to do that will heighten this and make it more alive for a reader? And so that's where my attention goes with that kind of work.
You mentioned reading the poems over the phone to your friend, and I read in another of your interviews recently how much sound plays a role as a device in your poetry and the importance of reading poems aloud to an audience to get that feedback directly from them and to see what's working. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more on the importance of sound in your work.
I'd love to. It's one of the things that's sort of deepest to my work and my heart. Part of it is that I tend to process words more auditorially than visually. I tend to hear words. I tend to see words as air filling space and volume decaying. And so for me, I actually at best make poems when I feel them as sound, when I speak them out loud, when I'm writing them, and then when I convert them to text on the page from there. And I find that the poems find their home and their space and what they do best when I've shared them in draft form in a public space and see how people respond, see how the sound carries in rooms larger than my living room, and what it feels like to put it out that way. It's very deeply rooted in me. I loved playing music when I was young, and when I was at the very beginning of my career, I worked in a recording studio, and I worked both on film soundtracks and record albums. And in the process of doing that, I got highly sensitized to sound and shaping sound as a tool. For poets, I think sound is extraordinarily important, and oftentimes it's something that's in academic poetry it's paid lip service to, but it's not really worked through. Poetry came from oral tradition, and it came from song. And for any poet, not just someone who's oriented towards sound as I am, if in the writing and in the revising of a poem, you speak it out loud and you learn the craft of speaking out loud and reading well, you're going to find layers of meaning. You're going to find layers of sonic connection between the words, some of which are working and some of which are not, but that simply won't be evident from reading the poem and editing on the page as a conceptual exercise. And so over the years, I've worked with a number of people to help them learn how to voice their own poems and become better writers, better poets in doing that. And it's something that I believe in strongly and recommend to absolutely every poet, whether you're doing it just as an amateur for fun or whether you're making this your life's work or whether it's a vocation that you pursue amongst other things. Finding a way to put words in air and on air, feeling those resonances and knowing how the consonants and the clusters and the vowels and the syllables relate as sound will simply make you a better poet.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Finding those rhythms and the right cadence with each piece, and just having that, almost that foundational idea of everything is vibrations in this world to begin with, and so having that connection with the audience and them with you, sound is so important, and couldn't agree with more with what you said there. You talked about working with other poets to help them develop those skills. Can you talk a little bit more about the advisory services that you have and what that process is like when you're working with other artists?
So I started working as a creative development advisor. That's sort of the term I made up for it, where I work with artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers, actors, directors, pretty much anyone in the creative life, and sometimes also people who are doing science and creative things outside the arts. And the essence of what I try to do with people is figure out where are they in their creative lives and what do they need to blossom, as I like to say, to thrive and shine. And sometimes that's working with them to help them develop their skills or their confidence or to develop an aesthetic for their work. Other times it's helping them complete a specific project. So it may be a poet's got a body of work that they want to shape into something like a chapbook or a book, or they are simply interested in developing a theme for a while, and will work on a project like that. Or in the case of a novelist, they may be working toward a draft or have a draft that they want to review. A painter may be preparing for a show. Other times what we do is we work on their growth as an artist. They may be going through a major life transition, or they may have gotten to a point where the meaning in their work isn't there the way it used to be, and they've got a crisis of meaning, and the question is, how do I work through that crisis of meaning or that transition in life? And we dig into that and work on that long as it takes to get through to the other side.
Fantastic. It's almost a therapeutic type of practice mixed with the creative aspects of art. Those two sort of go together so well to begin with. I don't know if we discussed this before the show or not, but do you have any poems that you'd like to read here today?
Sure, I'd love to. Do you want something from the Typewriter Underground?
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, so the way I've set up the book is that it's wrapped by a prelude and a coda, which are poems that are about the typewriter underground, but sort of the first one is written as an induction to try and get you into a state that lets you go down the rabbit hole into this world. And it's called Milonga, and a milonga is both a kind of tango, but it also refers to an all-night dance where people dance the tango into the early hours of the morning or until the sun breaks. And so this piece, which is the first poem in the book, is called Milonga. And in tango, the deep premise is that one's looking for a lost place to bring it back, a lost life, a lost love, something that you can call to life through the music and the movement. And so for me, that idea was a good way to begin to open the world of the typewriter underground. So this is called Milonga. Cultivating memories of a life but imagined, more than passion, a desire beyond duende, a yearning for longing, conjured by dance, a saudade for a past that would have been worth the longing. The sound of piano squeeze box and typewriter playing in a dusty, tired-floored stucco dance hall in a melancholy black and white fever dream, in a mood for lost love never had nor was. The dancers backward traveling to Angel Violdo, heels conjuring the clack of the salon de tango, eyes locking lean frames in perpetual oriero, traveling past the ghost orchestra Pichuco. Their exhaustion keeps them from wondering what will happen when, with the sun, this milonga ends. The warmth of their damp through cloth long bodies gone to chill in the dawn graveyard of the workday life. Their exhaustion dissolves all but the floor, the lights, the walk, the turn, the tilt, the entwining of legs, the release, the burgundy print, wrap-dress ladies in chairs waiting, hoping for a dance before they dissolve with the dawn, never knowing if they have entered the typist's heart, which summons them nightly from the land of their sad dreams to the dim incandescence of this hall of violins, a soft habanera rising from the page.
Great work.
Thank you.
I want to hear some more, but I have a question first. With
Sure.
all the characters that you created in this book, are there any that stick out as favorites, or are they all like children?
That's a great question. I think they're all children, and which ones are favorites, I think, depends on my mood and the group that I'm reading with. But one that stands out as sort of a consistent favorite for me and among people who've read it and people who've seen the character created in various venues is Prolixity Ferris. And she's a hypergraphic Dakini. Hypergraphia is some would view it as a neurological condition or an illness, others as a state of liberation, but it's the need and the ability to write constantly and almost a compulsion to write all the time on everything. And so this is a character who has that quality and turns it into kind of a high spiritual practice. So she's truly a favorite.
Oh, very nice. I know a friend of mine, one of the most prolific poets I know, Ryan Quinn Flanagan, has talked about having that condition, that need to constantly be writing. And I think that character in your book actually like draws on herself and writes, and very, very cool idea behind that one. So yeah, is there any other piece you're interested in reading today?
Well, sure. Why don't I read that one since we just talked about it? And
yeah, perfect.
So it goes like this. Prolixity Ferris's writing instruments were legendary. Tile marker for the shower, wax pencil for glass, henna for her paper skin. Vintage fountain pens whose nibs cut paper, just so. And an armada of pencils, pens, quills, and styli. Since the day she had formed her first letter, words flowed and flowed and flowed and flowed, until she had filled her small world with calligraphy. If a surface was empty, her words flew to it. And so she became a high master of yoga. Through exotic poses arranged into series that were formally known as the Pen Asanas, she developed almost magic capacity to cover every inch of her skin with writing, often flowing from the henna brush in her toes, onto the small of her back, the back of her thighs, the curve behind her ears, and the lids of her eyes. Each word, in its shape and intent, fitted perfect to the cutaneous locale, a completion of a thought suspended until ink it resolved. What then brought this miraculous hypergraphic dakini into the world of typewriter strikes? Some said it was the adrenaline rush of pure speed. Others claimed that eyes to page freed her mind. Some said it was the unending brown paper rolls which her students and acolytes stole from restrooms and placed in symmetric columns by her machine, standing gravely by like musical page-turners, ready to seamlessly replace a finished roll, her typographic flow never interrupted. The rolls ceremoniously connected end to end by the most fastidious gluists and binders became known as the Great Scroll of Prolixity, and to the mystically inclined, the Wheel of Ferris, believing that it unwound the cycle of life. The activity that surrounded Prolixity neither attracted nor concerned her. She just typed, and when handed a silk glove by an apostle who noticed that she had typed through her right-hand skin, she proclaimed, "A glove supreme," and continued on.
Beautiful. I love that idea that you said of it being liberating, that condition. It's almost like being tapped into the Holy Spirit of creativity at all times. Just that overflow of emotion just pouring out of the imagery in that particular piece. And I had a flash of Jack Kerouac sitting there writing or typing out on the road. I think he did it all on one scroll of paper, and when you mentioned those students stacking them up around there, it just seemed like this energy of bursting through. It's a great character.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, the Kerouac scroll was definitely an inspiration for that. It's funny, the year before this book came out, I was asked by Simon Warner and Jim Sampis. Simon is a scholar of the beats, and Jim is the literary executor of Jack Kerouac's estate, to contribute a couple of poems about Kerouac to a book that they were doing called Kerouac on Record, a literary soundtrack. And so I spent a tremendous amount of time listening to Kerouac's recordings of his poetry, of reading from his novels, of the albums he did with Steve Allen, and picking up on what he called bop prosody, learning how to work in those rhythms, and then wrote some poems for this book that Jim and Simon put together that tried to bring that aspect of Kerouac to life. So that influence is definitely playing in me over the last couple of years, and I'm sure that it had a direct effect on Prolixity. Oh,
very cool. That's I'd love to read those poems you wrote about Kerouac.
I'd be happy to send them your way. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to do the project, and the book is mostly essays and interviews and things like that. The two poems that I contributed were the only poems in the book, so it was a wonderful experience to be able to be part of that larger project.
Oh, yeah, very cool. We're coming down to about 5 minutes left in the show. I wanted to close out. You had sent me a couple of pieces of improvisational jazz that had been born out of one of the productions of the Typewriter Underground that you've been involved with. So any final words that you have for the audience and about the book, and then also if you could set up where those clips came from, and I'll close out with those.
So thank you first, Scott. It's been a wonderful opportunity to chat with you, and I've really enjoyed the interview. The book is called La Commedia Sotterranea della Macchina da Scrivere, which in Italian means the underground comedy of the typewriter, and it's a play on Dante's Divine Comedy. The subtitle, which is in English and easier to remember, is Swizzlefeld's First Folio from the Typewriter Underground. It's out on Pelicanesis Press, and it's widely available. You can get it at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and directly from the press. The segments that you're going to hear were live recordings by a group named Mordecai, who created the score and largely improvised soundtrack for the live production of the Typewriter Underground in Big Sur at Henry Miller. And the group is 3 people, Trevor Lucier, Jetty Grant, and River Naval, and they did just an extraordinary job. So what you're hearing is live from the Henry Miller Show.
Okay, fantastic, and we'll close on that. And thanks so much for joining the program, Mark. Love the book and love what you're doing with all these collaborations, and much more success in 2019.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's been a pleasure.
All right, thank you. So this is Freak Show by Mordecai.
Wow.